Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everyone, both those in person here at our beautiful headquarters at 31 Bligh Street and those joining us online for this important speech by the Treasurer of Australia, the Honourable Dr Jim Chalmers MP. I'm Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. Let me recognise many friends in the room today, including the Deputy Chairman of the Institute, Stephen Lowy, the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Kennedy, the AFP Commissioner, Reece Kershaw, the Chief Justice of New South Wales, Andrew Bell, and many other friends. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the Institute stands, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders. Ladies and gentlemen, the Lowy Institute has always been interested in the connections between politics, security, and economics. And in recent years, these connections have quickened. A global pandemic shut down international travel and seized up the machinery of globalisation. Geopolitical tensions have resulted in trade sanctions and campaigns of economic coercion. Wars in Europe and the Middle East have opened our eyes to the vulnerabilities of global supply chains. For Australia, these challenges are real. We are proximate to some of the world's greatest economic opportunities, as well as some of its sharpest rivalries. Alongside these international issues, there are significant domestic economic pressures, including the increased cost of living and the many demands on the public purse, from the NDIS to the need to budget properly for the nuclear-powered submarines to be acquired under AUKUS. And the person who is responsible for resolving many of these tensions is Australia's Treasurer, Dr Jim Chalmers, and it's our pleasure to host him at the Institute today. I've known and admired Jim for many years. I met him when he was writing his PhD on Paul Keating. It was entitled Brawler Statesman, if I remember correctly, Jim. He went on to serve as Deputy Chief of Staff to Opposition Leader Kim Beazley and Deputy Chief of Staff and then Chief of Staff to Treasurer Wayne Swan. He was elected to the Federal Parliament as the member for Rankin in 2013 and held a number of shadow portfolios, including sport and finance. Upon Labor's victory in May 2022, he became Treasurer of Australia. After his remarks today, Jim has agreed to take some questions. In the meantime, let me invite the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, to the lectern. Welcome, mate. Good luck.
Good afternoon, everyone. For tens of thousands of years, the Gadigal people cared for the country we meet on today, and we acknowledge their elders, customs, traditions, and all First Nations people who are here. Michael, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the generous introduction, for hosting us, for your leadership, and also for your friendship, which I can hardly believe now spans 2 decades. Stephen and the Lowy family and all of the distinguished guests who are here today. Can I simply say it's an honour to be here with so many great people and at this institute, which is an Australian creation worthy of the immense respect and renown that it has earned here in our own country and abroad as well. Today is a little under 2 weeks before the budget, and it's a little under 2 weeks since I returned from the G20 and IMF's spring meetings in Washington, DC. And we had plenty to talk about. There is some welcome resilience in the global economy, but we still face a perilous outlook, fraught and fragile. Inflation is moderating but lingering, especially in North America. Growth is weak in China and it's slowing in other major economies. The Middle East conflict has escalated, risking higher oil prices. The war in Ukraine continues. Supply chains are fragmenting while the global economy transforms. A soft landing in the global economy is assumed but not assured. These are the key contemporary factors influencing the coming budget. They are pressing and they are substantial, especially when it comes to inflation, which will still be the major near-term focus of the budget. But what I wanted to do today was to take this opportunity in front of an informed audience like this one to talk about Australia's longer-term choices and chances. And I really wanted to make this argument today. Australia can be a primary beneficiary of a changing and churning global economy, just like we were primary beneficiaries of the calm that preceded it. But only if we make ourselves indispensable to the net zero transformation. Only if we align our economic and security interests more tightly, and only if we invest and engage, not just protect or retreat. Now, visiting Washington again a fortnight ago, participating in the discussions about where we are and where we're going in the global economy, I was reminded that we are just a couple of months short of the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference that created the framework for the post-war economy. America then, and in the immediate post-war years, accounted for half of global output. And it was American power which provided the weight and the heft and the ballast to ensure the new structure worked. The IMF and the World Bank provided the tools and the ideas to bring it into being. Australia was an enthusiastic contributor to the design of that new global economic order, imagined in the war and fashioned in its aftermath. With John Curtin's strong support, Ben Chifley, as Treasurer, led Australia's engagement with this creation. Chifley made sure that Australia was never a bystander, always a participant, a mediator, a motivator. His determination was evident in how he directed and instructed some outstanding public servants. As early as 1942, Chifley had Roland Wilson in London for discussions with Keynes about a global central bank. In 1943, Nugget Coombs was in Washington for talks about the dollar. And 2 months later, he was in London to talk with Keynes about trade and the Australian idea that there should be a global commitment to full employment, which could support demand for our exports abroad and create jobs here at home. Leslie Melville, an outstanding public servant, was our representative at Bretton Woods and a widely respected one. And because of his contribution, Australia there was said to be more Keynesian than Keynes. Melville's dogged pursuit of Chifley's global full employment objective didn't prevail there, but it did influence the debate. Coombs represented us in what became the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, I run through this history because this practice of serious engagement and participation, Australia as persuader, meant that we were well placed to be beneficiaries of the order that Bretton Woods helped create. By the 1980s, it had provided much of the institutional and intellectual basis for the Washington Consensus of fiscal discipline, floating exchange rates, liberalised capital flows, and the free movement of people and goods. It was a world that Australia found congenial, a world only upended by the 2008 financial crisis, severe recessions in the US and Europe, an uncertain recovery that ended with COVID, and a subsequent spike in inflation, which crested not long ago. So Australia was among the most determined contributors to the thinking behind the Bretton Woods institutions, but also among the major beneficiaries of the stability they helped underwrite for the 2 decades between the Berlin Wall coming down and the global financial system blowing up. The last 16 years of the global economy have been much more difficult. A decade and a half punctuated by the unmistakable signs of climate change, a pandemic and a European war which both exposed fragilities in our supply chains and which spurred a damaging spike in inflation. As the great moderation of the 1980s onwards gave way to the great fragmentation. Alongside a changing pattern and primacy of US influence amidst a great power context with China and its support for freedom and self-determination in Europe against the aggression of Putin, the Americans have been forced to reconsider their own assumptions and their own strategies, leading to a major renewal of their own industrial policies. A speech last year by Michael's friend, Jake Sullivan, set out the intellectual and strategic contours of US thinking. As much as what he said, the truly remarkable thing, I think, was that he said it at all. When the US National Security Advisor is giving an economic speech about industry policy and the middle class at Brookings, you know that the Inflation Reduction Act is as much about security as about prosperity. Just as when the Australian Treasurer fronts the Lowy Institute 13 days from the budget, it tells you something about the fusion of Australia's international and domestic ends and the integration of the government's economic and strategic means. I think too often contemporary Australian politics has assumed an artificial distinction between our prosperity and our security that Anthony's government and the key ministers within it have tried to erode, if not erase. We recognise that in facing the most challenging strategic environment since World War II, economic resilience is an essential component of assuring our national security. This is part of what our government means when we talk about the need for unprecedented coordination and ambition in our statecraft, harnessing all elements of our national power to advance Australia's interests. And the budget will be key in this regard. There'll be a familiar premium on responsibility, but a greater emphasis on security. National security and economic security. Security in churn and change, not just security from churn and change. Now, at those G20 and IMF meetings in Washington, there was much that was familiar to me from my days advising Treasurer Swan in the Rudd and Gillard governments. Running off the jet lag on the mall, the coffee cups with the little retro IMF logo, the perfectly white chairs, the charismatic, reassuring presence of Christine Lagarde. All the settings and all the set pieces, very familiar to me. But there was a key difference this time around. Not just the renewed focus on security, but a sense that we're now in a new phase in the global economy, one that is only just now becoming evident. Because only now, only after the 2008 financial crisis, the recessions in Europe and North America, the slow output growth that followed, after the pandemic and the subsequent acceleration of inflation in many economies, only now are the longer-term underlying issues in the global economy becoming more discernible. We're no longer just dealing with sudden and unexpected shocks, tensions in the Middle East or new developments in Ukraine notwithstanding. We're not only dealing with the now, as important as that remains. But in DC, it was as if for the first time since the global financial crisis, it's possible for global leaders to think about what the next 10 to 20 years might look like. And in turn, for Australian leaders to think about how a nation should shape itself in response. It was also evident at those meetings that many of the big problems we face are global. I'm talking here about climate change, but not only about climate change. Fragmentation of markets is another, limiting our choices. There are some other unfavourable trends. Global growth will be harder to come by. Populations are declining in major economies like China and Japan and Korea. And this decline could be offset by faster growth in productivity, but in most economies, productivity growth has slowed over the last few decades. And there's been a stupendous increase in industrial subsidies, particularly among the major economic powers. So the environment that we face today and in the decade ahead is vastly different. Heightened geostrategic competition, an international system under continuous pressure, demographic change, greater risk of major supply shocks to supply chains, and a restructuring of global trade from the net zero transformation. All of these changes require us to be engaged in the world and in our region by designing new markets and modernising old ones so that we can sustain growth and lift living standards, and advocating for the interests of the Pacific, particularly when it comes to capital flows and climate resilience. But we also do need to think or rethink how we act at home. The scale of subsidies in the three major global economies, of course, dwarfs anything that Australia can offer, which is why we need to be strict and smart. We can't replicate or retrofit the approaches underway elsewhere, but it would be preposterously self-defeating to leave our policies unchanged in the face of all of this industry policy taking shape and taking hold around us. Your recent guest at the Lowy lecture at the end of last year, Fareed Zakaria, has done a characteristically compelling job in his book, The Age of Revolutions, setting out 4 of these key big changes in economics, technology, identity and geopolitics. And our own intergenerational report details 5 big trends and transitions, from younger to older, from globalisation to fragmentation, from IT to AI, from hydrocarbons to renewables, and from an old industrial base to a new one. Amidst all of this change, we have to be clear-eyed about where our comparative advantages and national interest imperatives lie, working proactively with our trading partners to get the most efficient and secure supply to market, and recognising and responding to the way our societies and our economies are changing and how the pace of that change is accelerating. Now, in this world of churn and change, I back our chances and I like our choices. And where it matters most and where our response will be the most determinative and transformative is in how we manage changes to the composition of our industrial base and our economy in the context of the net zero transformation. That's because our biggest opportunities as a country lie at the intersection of industry, energy, resources, human capital, and our ability to attract and deploy investment. Our goals here are really clear: to be among the primary beneficiaries of churn and change, to prosper from that change, not just protect ourselves from it, to align our national security and our economic security interests, to deliver a new generation of growth which we recognise will be different to the last one, to make Australia a renewable energy superpower and an indispensable part of the global net zero economy. And that's what a future made in Australia is all about: powering the future, not manufacturing the past. To modernise and strengthen our economy in a world built with cleaner and cheaper energy. To maximise our genuine advantages: geological, meteorological, geographical and geopolitical. To determine rigorously and pursue robustly our most compelling imperatives, both economic and strategic. To project, not protect. To engage and invest, not retreat. To incentivise private investment, not just replace it. And all while recognising our constraints. Our medium-sized open economy and small population means we don't have the internal markets to insulate ourselves from the world in ways that others can, even if we wanted to. Traded goods and services are almost half of our GDP, compared with the US at closer to a quarter. And more than 70% of traded products are produced with supply chains that cut across multiple countries. So a future made in Australia doesn't mean a future made alone. It will take an outward focus. Yes, securing our own supply chains, but also plugging into the supply chains of our region. But we also need to recognise that some global markets have not yet caught up to the big global shifts that we are facing. There is no global policy architecture in place for the net zero transformation. There are no global markets capable of fully pricing in the risks associated with a more unstable geopolitical landscape. Which means in the face of today's transitions and global uncertainties, we don't yet have the right price signals to drive the private investment that we need. It's why I've been advocating for better designed markets at the G20 to better differentiate and reward resources which are produced at higher standards. Where markets don't yet exist or in their early stages, there can be a case for targeted temporary support to crowd in private investment, especially in industries that meet strict criteria. For us, this rigour will be imposed by the Future Made in Australia Act that the Prime Minister flagged last month. And today I wanted to sketch out the framework that will help underpin that legislation. We will set 5 tests on where we act and how. First, is the industry one where we can be competitive and more productive? Second, does it contribute to an orderly path to net zero? Third, can it build the capabilities of our people and especially our regions? Fourth, will it improve Australia's national security and economic resilience? And fifth, does it recognise the key role of the private sector and deliver genuine value for money for government? The Act will also outline criteria for 2 streams. A national interest stream, where domestic sovereign capability is necessary to protect our national security interests or ensure our economy is sufficiently resilient to shocks. This will have a focus only on the most critical risks to avoid a costly mindset of trying to eliminate all risk. And a net zero transformation stream where industry support carbonisation and there is a reasonable prospect of a self-sustaining comparative advantage. Our initial focus on refining and processing critical minerals, producing renewable hydrogen, exploring production of green metals and low-carbon liquid fuels, and supporting targeted manufacturing of clean energy technologies, including value adding in the battery supply chain, reflects this rigour. And critical technologies like quantum computing are essential here as well. From batteries to biopharmaceuticals, from solar capture to AI, the leap forward offered by quantum computing could also be a leap forward in our ambition to make a future here in Australia. The announcement made by the PM and Minister Husic in Brisbane yesterday means this is a chance that won't pass us by, as we work in partnership with PsiQuantum to build a quantum computer in my home state of Queensland and to help initiate the next wave of innovation in our economy. This is one example of substantial public investment, and the nature and timing of this investment will vary by technology, in part reflecting differences in maturity, and some details will be informed by more detailed consultation. They will also be tailored to address specific barriers, whether it's supporting innovation, providing a green premium that's missing from the market, reducing a competitiveness gap from global subsidies, or leveraging our investment vehicles to de-risk projects and reduce upfront costs. But here I wanted to be really clear and say nobody is claiming we have the scale to compete in every industry. Nobody is saying that these interventions will be permanent or that we should retreat from trade or make every single one of the goods that we need here. Nobody is saying we need to outspend or compete dollar for dollar with the scale or internal markets of much bigger economies. And nobody is saying that this will involve solely public investment. Public investment, as important and substantial as it will be, is a key, and that key will help unlock the hundreds of billions of dollars in private capital that we will need to deploy to meet our objectives. And that's why the budget will have a big emphasis on attracting and deploying investment from the private sector. It's why there will be financial incentives and regulatory changes and other enablers. It's also why we are overhauling and reforming and strengthening and streamlining our foreign investment framework. Foreign investment is a really big part of my job, and properly managed, it's a big part of our economic success. Our levels of foreign direct investment have sat above the OECD average since 2006, boosting innovation and skills development and helping to drive our prosperity. Australia welcomes foreign investment, but only if it's in our national interest. And the global conditions I've described today demand a rethink of the regime that underpins it. Foreign investment is where the stovepipes of economic and national security have often failed to meet in the past, or where even whole-of-government thinking has been stuck in a crude model of trade-offs and compromises. So I announced today that the Albanese government will reform and renew our foreign investment framework to make it work better for investors, for our economy and for our national security, to strengthen it where we need to and to streamline it where we can, to make it more robust, more efficient and more transparent. Streamlining means investors we already know who are making investments that don't raise any sensitivities and who have a good compliance record will get decisions faster. This will be supported by a new target of processing 50% of cases within the initial statutory timeframe of 30 days from the start of next year. Stronger means a risk-based approach will allow us to process and monitor more complicated cases in a more effective, more robust and more meaningful way. We will dedicate more resources to screening foreign investment in critical infrastructure, critical minerals, critical technology, those that involve sensitive data sets and investments near defence sites to ensure that all risks are identified and understood and can be properly managed. We'll bolster Treasury's ability to better monitor and enforce the conditions we put on these transactions, including boosted capability to undertake on-site visits. This will also support the use of my call-in power to review investments that come to pose security concerns over time. We'll also tighten up the tax guidance and scrutiny to make sure investors pay their fair share, and we'll update the framework on emerging risks. This will improve the conditions we put on transactions, how we respond more quickly to behaviour designed to avoid scrutiny, and making sure that all of this aligns with other regulatory frameworks as well. We're also flagging today work that will happen from now with other ministerial colleagues on key areas in their portfolios, And today I'm releasing more detail in an updated foreign investment guidelines to make our changes clearer to investors. Now, in a world upturned, we aren't just updating our foreign policy investment regime, we are upgrading our growth model as well. My predecessor, Michael's old boss, Paul Keating, talked about creating Australia's third economy. What we do now in these years ahead of us can and must create its fourth, with a combination of heavy industries and the care economy, a combination of technology and human capital, and a combination of new opportunities in cleaner and cheaper energy and traditional strengths. Recognising that the challenge of our time is not to resist change, but to make our people its primary beneficiaries. Again, I think Zakaria captures it best when he wrote that we aren't choosing here between markets and the state. We are choosing between the push and pull of the past and the future. And I say respectfully to our critics that this is the point that they sometimes miss. If we stand still, the world will move past us, leaving Australia at the very beginning and at the very end of supply chains, and not in the middle where so much of the value lies. Watching as our industries are hollowed out and others benefit from the opportunities that right at this moment sit with us, as we become more vulnerable, less prosperous and less secure as a consequence. And this is not the future that we imagine for Australia. We believe every Australian can benefit from the churn and change in the global economy if every leading Australian plays his or her role, including the opinion shapers who are here today. I don't think the big fault line in our public life runs between the activists and the commentators. I know political leaders often see it in those terms. We all love to think of ourselves in Teddy Roosevelt's arena, and it's tempting because it's flattering, but it's not really true today. The fault line is between the nostalgists and the strategists. I'm conscious today that I started my speech with a heap of history, but partly to make the point that we need to learn from that history rather than dwell in it. I don't believe for one moment that Chifley put Coombs on a plane and said, "Mate, do what they would have done in 1904. Nobody told Paul in 1984 to recreate the economy of 1944. Nor does any intelligent person say the same thing of 1984 and 2024 either. The opportunities of a world upturned lie ahead of us, not behind us. And I truly believe that we can become an island of reliability in a sea of global uncertainty, creating a place for ourselves in this new economic order powered by cleaner and cheaper energy, and becoming, in that effort, more secure as Australians in the world that we help shape and the future that we make together. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Jim, thank you. Thank you for very thoughtful and important remarks. At the end, you divided the world into nostalgists and strategists. I guess as an historian and the head of the Lowy Institute, I feel I have a foot in each camp. Thank you for making news today, which is something we always encourage our speakers to do. And thank you for agreeing to take our questions. I've got a bunch of questions, and if I have time, I'm going to go to one or two questions from the audience too. Let me start with the foreign investment changes that you set out today. It's a significant tightening of foreign investment rules in what you call more complicated cases involving, as you laid out, critical infrastructure, minerals, tech, data, and near defence sites. It occurs to me that given the importance of foreign investment to Australia over the years, and given you're the senior economic minister in the government, you would only be instituting this kind of change if you had serious concerns about the security implications of these kinds of complicated investments. And you've sat in the cabinet now for 2 years, you've sat on the NSC for 2 years. So tell us, how has this affected, how has this changed your thinking about the vulnerabilities that foreign investment can create?
Well, firstly, I acknowledge there's a bunch of colleagues here who help provide the kind of advice that treasurers need to make these often difficult decisions about foreign investment bids. And one of the things that I've noticed, as have the colleagues who are here today, is that the system gets gummed up by a lot of bids that have had to go back to the beginning and go through a process, even though the investors know and the government knows that it's uncontroversial, not especially sensitive, and almost certain to be approved. And so by saying at the front end, we're going to categorise lower risk to higher risk proposals, and by not gumming up the system with the lower risk ones, we can put a lot more effort and attention on the higher risk ones. And I think that's really important because sitting on the NSC, sitting around the cabinet table, having worked on some of these issues in the past, you know, we've got this luxury in Australia that we're an attractive destination. That's overwhelmingly a good thing, and we've got the ability to decide what's in our national interest and not. Any self-respecting country screens its investments. And so we've got the ability to say much more clearer, much more robustly, that there are some investments in some of these critical industries where the supply chain is at risk, that we are going to take a much tighter, much stronger, more robust view of it. And for me, by clearing up the non-sensitive part of the regime, it means we can devote our time and our energy and resources to the difficult ones. And part of that means making sure that people comply with decisions that have already been taken, whether by me or by Treasurer Frydenberg or his predecessors. So for me, it will make a big difference in the way that we come at these proposals. I am pro-foreign investment, and I think it's a big part of our future, particularly when we think about these big challenges. But in order for it to be a big part of our future, it's got to be robust, and we're making it more robust with this announcement.
All right, I've heard you say this morning that these changes are country agnostic, but do you think that they'll have a chilling effect on Chinese investment into Australia?
I wouldn't have thought so, and on earlier occasions where the regime has been changed or tightened up, including, to his credit, by Josh, when he introduced an element of retrospectivity to the system, we didn't see a chilling of investment from one part of the world or another. So I wouldn't anticipate it here. And we are serious when we say what we care about with these investments is who's making the investment, what the structure of the deal is, and what industry we're seeing this investment in or this proposed investment in. And that applies equally to different parts of the world. Obviously, we take a firmer view of state-owned enterprises, but China is not the only part of the world that has state-owned enterprises. But our approach is non-discriminatory and it's not country-specific. And so I wouldn't expect there to be a reaction from China or from any other part of the world.
All right, let me ask you about the announcements that you made today and in previous days about the deployment of public money to build sovereign capability and also to support decarbonisation. And you set out helpfully, I think, the 5 tests about when the government should act. As you point out, you're swimming with the stream here in a way. The US and China, there's been, I think, what you called a stupendous increase in subsidies. But economic dries would say, look, just because they're doing something that's not intelligent economically doesn't mean that we should do it. And they would say government is not good at deciding which industries and firms can be competitive in the long term without government support. That who knows, how would we know whether this quantum computing firm or that quantum computing firm is on the right track or the wrong track? So why are you confident that these investments will deliver value for money in the long term? And also, let's say you pick some winners, how do you let go of the losers over time when they're on the public tap?
I understand that the sorts of things the Prime Minister and I have been talking about in recent weeks are contested, as they should be. We are talking about substantial public investment in the future of our economy and effectively a new growth model for our economy. And I understand and appreciate and expect that will be contested. People will hold that up to the light. There will be a public debate about that, which I welcome. But I don't think anybody looking objectively at how the world is changing and assessing in a hard-headed way what Australia's role in that world is can come to any other sensible conclusion that we need to do things differently. And what I've tried to resist, and the reason I don't use the language you used at the end of your question and won't repeat it now about winners and losers, is because I don't see this as some kind of throwback to how things were done in the past. You know, you started this conversation today talking about being a historian and a strategist with a foot in both camps. I think it's possible to understand the past, but not obsess about it, not live there permanently. And so I don't see what we're proposing now as being some kind of throwback to how things used to be done. That's why I said it's not about manufacturing the past, it's about powering the future. The big difference is the way the world is moving and the way that the primary opportunity in the new global economy is the net zero transformation. And to that, we bring the most extraordinary advantages: geological, geopolitical, meteorological, the ones that I ran through. And so I think, even if you're someone like me who has not been seen as especially interventionist in the way that I come at our challenges at the economy, I think that there is a really compelling case. But having come to that conclusion, the responsibility on all of us, but I think especially on me and our cabinet, is to make sure we get value for money, and that's why I want to legislate these very rigorous tests.
All right, you mentioned decarbonisation. Let me ask you about climate change and Chinese technology, if I can, because some commentators say there's a tension between security imperatives and moving as quickly as we can to deal with climate change, that we can use cheap technology from China to decarbonise as quickly as possible, but of course that gives China more leverage in our economy, or we can choose to decarbonise more slowly by using more expensive homegrown technology. Is that a tension, do you think, and how do we resolve that tension?
Well, I think in foreign policy and in budgeting and in all of the enterprises that people here are involved in policing and all kinds of different ways, our job is to strike a series of fine balances. I think that's the case here. You know, we can recognise that we can be beneficiaries of cheaper technology produced in other parts of the world at the same time as we realise we've got a role to play in making those supply chains more robust. And the reason why the kind of central organising principle of my speech today was we were the big beneficiaries of calm and consensus, and now we can be big beneficiaries of churn and change, is because as the world, other players in the world are looking around at their supply chains, they're trying to work out how do they make them more reliable, and we've got a huge role to play there. You know, we're one of the best positioned countries when it comes to people reorganising and rethinking their supply chains because we are reliable, we are stable, we have a great resources base, a great human capital base. We're an attractive destination for investment, as we've been talking about. And so in that world, we can strike a balance between being a beneficiary of the way that costs come down with scale and production around the world, at the same time as we play an important role in these supply chains, which is helping make them more diverse. And if you think about the big lessons that the world learned during COVID, was that their supply chains weren't resilient or robust enough, they were too risky. And I think Australia has a role to play in de-risking some of those supply chains.
I'm going to take one or two very quick questions if people will keep their questions brief. So please put up your hand. And I see Peter Harcher right at the back, so I'll take a question from Peter, first of all.
Thanks, Michael. Jim, I'd like to, well, you've asked us all in this room to join you in moving from nostalgia to strategy and to help shape the climate of opinion, as you've already said. But when you talk about the role of the state and public subsidies, you are turning 40 years of established thinking and ideology and policy in Australia on its head. So you've said that you will need to be strict and smart in how those subsidies are applied. Can I ask you two elements of that?
Just quickly, Peter.
Yeah, one is to follow up on your question, Michael. Michael asked you, how will you judge when to cut loose a public investment that is failing? And the second part of that is, will you apply hurdle rates of return? What tests of economic or commercial success will you apply on these very large investments you've only just started to announce? $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money, as the saying goes.
Thanks, Peter. I think what you'll see in the budget is that we're not relying exclusively on one mechanism or another, that it will be a combination of incentives in the tax system, upfront grants for innovation, economy-wide investment versus specific. And because of that, each element of that will have different exit strategies and off-ramps. Some of it will be time limited. Some of it will be through our investment vehicles, which will have a big role to play and a lot to say about our prospects here. And so it depends on the mechanism. But certainly, as we've gone about the hard work of putting together this package, we have recognised that sometimes we need to build in exit strategies. And I know that the appointment I made to the head of the PC, her comments have attracted a lot of attention. But I agree with some of the things that Danielle Wood was saying about making sure we've got those off-ramps and making sure we've got that value for money. And what you'll see in the budget package in 13 days' time is the different mechanisms have got different ways that we are imposing that value for money.
I'll take one more question. I saw this gentleman here with his hand up in the middle of the room.
That's Peter from The Guardian.
Yeah, thank you, Treasurer and Michael. Peter Hannam from The Guardian. Let's assume next week there is a surplus in a similar line to last year's budget surplus, and therefore on the cash balance the budget is neutral. If you have mounting off-budget funds supporting the future made in Australia, how do you ensure that that doesn't add to demand in the economy and make the Reserve Bank's task harder? And look, just on the question of...
I'm going to limit you to one. Sorry, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. On the first part of your question, don't expect if there is a surplus, don't expect it to be of the magnitude of the last one, first point. But your broader point, the reason we're trying to still land a surplus, and we won't know for a little while yet whether we've been able to achieve that. But the reason we're going for that is not as an end in itself, but because we think running a tight ship on the budget is an important way of putting downward pressure on inflation. So that's the first part of it. Your question about the investment vehicles and demand in the economy, the most important thing to recognise there is all of this investment won't hit the economy at once and at the front end. Now, we're talking about a longer-term plan, and one of the challenges in this budget, which we have embraced in our thinking as we've put it together, is we've got this nearer-term primary focus on inflation, getting the budget in better shape, provide a cost of living help that takes the edge off inflation rather than add to it. That's our primary near-term focus. But we've tried not to let that come at the expense of a longer-term plan for growth in our economy, laying the foundations for growth. And that's why the budget effectively has three parts. The budget responsibility, running a tight ship. Secondly, cost of living help where we can do that in the most responsible way. And thirdly, laying the foundations for growth in the way that I've described in my speech.
Jim, I'm going to ask you the last question. You opened and closed your speech with history, and you talked about the Australian public servants and politicians who played a role in designing the international economic order 80 years ago. But as you noted, 80 years ago, the US was responsible for half of all global output. So it was relatively easy, in a way, for the victors to decide on what the settlement would be. And it's not a coincidence that Bretton Woods is in New Hampshire. These days, the United States produces a quarter of global output, and China's not far behind with a fifth. And of course, there's a contest between those two countries, and a lot of people believe those economies should decouple from each other. So does that great power contest make international economic reform these days impossible? And if it is possible, how would you like to see Australia shift the international economic order? If Australia can be the persuaders, what should we try to persuade the world about when it comes to reforming the international economic order?
Well, one of the things I think we've noticed, and we see it at the pointy end at the moment with the nickel market, is that the global economy and markets in the global economy have not completely caught up with the net zero transformation, the net zero opportunity. And so when I'm talking with my colleagues at these meetings in DC or before that in Brazil, one of our priorities has been to say, how do we make sure we can design a market that rewards people that will help us get to net zero faster? And you know, that is a contested space because there's a lot of cheap resources at the moment flooding the market and distorting global markets, but I think that's one of the necessary things that needs to happen. More broadly about decoupling, and this bifurcation that you talk about, obviously that would not be good for the global economy and not good for Australia, but we need to recognise that we don't have all of the agency in that, and so we need to work out how do we position ourselves to be beneficiaries of that rather than victims of that. And again, and the reason I'm optimistic about the future of our economy is because I think we are well placed in a world that is fragmenting and potentially bifurcating. We have the kind of human capital base and resources base and energy opportunity that makes us very compelling in this world of churn and change that I'm describing. And that's why, you know, I started the speech with some history, but also running through all of the things that are coming at us from around the world. But we've also got a lot of things going for us. And what I hope the budget will do is recognise all of these challenges, recognise all of these difficulties, including what's happening in the world, but try to convey to the Australians outside of this room that I like our chances. We've got a lot of reasons to be optimistic. Yes, things are a bit choppy right now, but the way that the global economy is unfolding, Australia has a lot going for us in that context. And our job as leaders in government, but also in all of the fields represented here, is to position ourselves to be beneficiaries rather than victims of all that change.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. Jim, thank you for taking time to address the Institute today. Thanks for taking our questions. I said I sympathise with both the nostalgists and the strategists. I also sympathise with those who are charged with making the big calls on behalf of Australia. So I wish you well in the lead up to the budget and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, the Treasurer.
Thank you. That's right. Thanks. Thanks so much.